At the Bornholmer Straße crossing, under the hard white lamps that turned breath into smoke, Lieutenant Colonel Harald Jäger stood behind glass and paperwork and watched the crowd swell until it became a single body with a single will. It was late on a Thursday, 9th of November, 1989, and Berlin's cold had the particular sting that makes a man feel the bones in his fingers even through a uniform. Beyond the barrier, the faces pressed close. Workers in thin jackets, women with shopping bags, students with the reckless heat of a moment sensed before it is understood. Someone began to shout, then many, and the chant gathered rhythm. "Tor auf! Open the gate!" Jäger's telephone rang and rang with no answer that could be carried like an order. His men looked to him, and he to the stamped passports, the heavy metal barrier, the narrow road that led, by a few meters of asphalt, out of one world and into another. The wall, that had been made for permanence, suddenly felt like a clerical error held in place by habit. History is often written as if it advances by the deliberate steps of statesmen, but the night the Berlin Wall opened began with an ambiguity, a sheet of paper, and a sentence spoken in the wrong tense. In the early evening, in a room where microphones and ashtrays shared the table, Günther Schabowski, an East German spokesman with the weary air of a man reciting decisions made elsewhere, conducted a press conference that had none of the drama of a proclamation. The German Democratic Republic, cornered by its own contradictions, had prepared a new regulation on travel, a partial loosening meant to bleed off pressure without surrendering control. Schabowski, not fully briefed, had been handed the draft shortly before he faced the cameras. A journalist asked when the new rule would take effect. Schabowski glanced down, hesitated, and then, as though clearing a minor point, replied that it was to be effective immediately, without delay, sofort, unverzüglich. In a system that worshipped the authority of the printed word, this was a small mistake with the force of a demolition charge. To understand why a phrase could loosen concrete, one must remember what the wall had been, not merely a barrier, but a diagnosis. In August 1961, when East Germany sealed the border and later poured the concrete and laid the wire, it was not to keep out invaders, but to keep in its own citizens. The state had proclaimed itself the workers' paradise. The workers voted with their feet. A modern government can endure much: economic miscalculation, bureaucratic cruelty, even the contempt of its subjects, so long as it can preserve the appearance of inevitability. But the steady flight of men and women from east to west, a plebiscite conducted in suitcases and tears, threatened that appearance. The wall was built to stop bodies. It succeeded also in shaping minds. For 28 years it turned a city into an argument made of stone, and it taught a generation that the horizon could be fenced. And yet no wall stands alone. It is supported by the scaffolding of international fear. East Germany existed as a political fact because the Second World War had ended not in reconciliation, but in a division of power. Berlin, conquered and occupied, became the symbolic center of that division, an island of western sectors deep inside the Soviet zone, and therefore a continual embarrassment to the East German regime. The wall was the most visible symptom of the Cold War's metaphysics, that human beings might be arranged into rival systems and held there by force until history decided which system deserved to survive. It took a generation for the costs of that metaphysics to accumulate into exhaustion. By 1989, the exhaustion was everywhere. The Soviet Union, once the guarantor of Eastern Europe's rulers, had begun to doubt its own capacity to pay for empire. Mikhail Gorbachev spoke of perestroika and glasnost, restructuring and openness, not out of sentiment but out of necessity, as a surgeon speaks of amputation. His reforms loosened the ideological grip that had held the bloc together, and his refusal to repeat the interventions of 1953, 1956, and 1968, those brutal reminders that Moscow's patience had limits, was itself a revolution. In Poland, solidarity moved from outlawry toward power. In Hungary, reformers opened the gate in the fence along the Austrian border and made a mockery of the Iron Curtain. East Germans began to leave not through Berlin, but through loopholes in the map, via Budapest, via Prague, via the West German embassy, where families camped in hallways and courtyards, waiting to be allowed to flee the state that called them its children. The East German leadership, old in temperament, if not always in years, responded as such leaderships do, by repeating slogans, tightening controls, and hoping that time would restore obedience. Erich Honecker, who had long presided with the dour certainty of a man convinced that history had already judged in his favor, fell in October. He was replaced by Egon Krenz, who inherited not a stable state, but a crisis of legitimacy. In Leipzig, on Mondays, crowds gathered after prayers and marched through the streets with candles, fragile flames carried against the wind of police power. The chants were plain and dangerous. Wir sind das Volk. We are the people. The state that claimed to embody the people suddenly faced the people as an opposing force, and its most feared weapon, violence, became unreliable. The policemen and soldiers, drawn from the same population, could not be certain that the order to strike would be obeyed or forgiven. It was against this background that the travel regulation was conceived, a bureaucratic compromise meant to look like reform without yielding the border. The idea, in the blunt language of survival, was to relieve the pressure of emigration and protest by allowing more travel, by giving citizens the illusion of choice while preserving the state's essential power, the right to grant or deny exit. The document was prepared with the careful hedging typical of regimes that fear their own people: applications, conditions, office hours. It was intended to take effect the next day, after the machine had time to arrange its paperwork. Schabowski's immediately removed that time. It converted the controlled release of steam into the sudden rupture of a boiler. In East Berlin, millions had long been bilingual in information. They watched East German television for official truth and West German broadcasts for the truth that was prohibited. That evening, the West's news programs seized upon Schabowski's words with the relish of a world grown accustomed to stalemate. "The GDR opens its borders," the headlines said, and the sentence traveled faster than any decree. In apartment blocks where radiators clanked and families ate late dinners, people looked at one another with the peculiar expression of those who have heard something impossible and must decide whether it is a rumor or a door. Telephones rang, neighbors knocked, stairwells filled with hurried footsteps. Not all were brave in the theatrical sense. Many were simply curious or tired, or moved by the contagious courage of a time when the old penalties seemed briefly suspended. They put on coats, took identity papers, and walked toward the wall as one walks toward a fire. At the border crossings, Bornholmer Straße, Invalidenstraße, Checkpoint Charlie, Oberbaumbrücke, guards found themselves facing a crowd whose insistence was, at first, almost polite. People asked to pass. The guards answered with the language of routine. The regulation was unclear, the computers were down, you needed a visa, come back tomorrow. But the crowd did not disperse. It grew. And in that growth lay the state's dilemma. To maintain the border by force would mean blood in the streets, and blood would mean the end of any remaining claim to reform. To open the border would mean surrendering the wall, which was to say, surrendering the very proof that the state could command obedience. The scene at Bornholmer Straße became emblematic because there the contradiction reached its breaking point. Jäger and his officers telephoned superiors, sought instructions, asked for written orders. The higher offices, built to give orders downward, were suddenly paralyzed by the knowledge that any order might become evidence in the court of history. They advised patience, they urged control, they offered no decisive command. Meanwhile, the crowd pressed closer, and the chant, "Open the gate," took on a physical force, as though it were pushing against metal. There were moments when the guards tried to manage the surge by allowing a few to pass, stamping passports in ways that would invalidate them, attempting to turn the crossing into a one-way valve. But even that tactic failed, because once the first were allowed through, the myth of impossibility was broken. The wall, which had relied as much on fear as on concrete, began to crumble in the mind before it opened, in fact. One must pause on the nature of that fear. For years, the border was enforced not only by armed men and regulations, but by the memory of consequences: interrogations, job loss, prison, the ruin of families. The Stasi had made a science of discouraging dissent by making everyone suspect everyone else. Yet such systems depend on a constant supply of belief that the state sees all, that it punishes always, that resistance is futile. On that night, belief faltered. The crowd did not behave like conspirators, it behaved like citizens. It stood in the open, in numbers that dissolved individual vulnerability. And the men with guns did not behave like instruments of ideology. They behaved like men who wished to go home alive and not be remembered as executioners. As the evening deepened, the pressure became less political and more elemental. People climbed onto walls near the crossings to see. West Berliners, alerted by radio and television, gathered on the other side, not as an organized welcoming committee, but as a city drawn by instinct to its own boundary. They came with flowers, beer, cameras, and the cautious joy of those who have lived too long in the shadow of catastrophe to trust good news. When the first East Berliners appeared, faces stunned, smiling, crying, their hands holding identity papers like talismans, there were embraces between strangers that seemed to ignore language, class, and the long pedagogy of division. It was one of those moments, rare in political life, when the personal and the historical touch without friction. A hand on a shoulder, a laugh, a sudden sob, and behind it the collapse of an arrangement maintained by armies. At approximately 11:30 at Bornholmer Straße, the barrier rose. It did not rise with a triumphant flourish. It rose because the alternative was chaos, and perhaps death. Jäger, facing a crowd that could no longer be contained, chose the option that spared blood. The gate opened and people poured through in a surge that was both orderly and ecstatic, like water finding a channel. They crossed not as defectors slipping away in shame, but as travelers walking into a city that had been theirs by geography and denied by politics. The West received them with applause, and in that applause there was not only welcome, but astonishment. Astonishment that an edifice of the Cold War, so long treated as permanent, could be undone in a night by human insistence. Once one crossing opened, the others could not remain sealed. The logic of walls is total. If they are porous at one point, they are no longer walls, but obstacles. As word spread that passage was possible, crowds moved to other checkpoints, and there too the guards, confronted by the same dilemma and the same absence of clear orders, yielded. The city became a map rewritten in footsteps. East Berliners drove their small cars, those boxy Trabants that had become symbols of scarcity, into the West, where streets glowed with neon and storefront abundance. West Berliners climbed onto the wall itself near the Brandenburg Gate, a place heavy with German symbolism. The old Prussian monument, the Nazi parades, the Soviet victory, the divided city. Now it became a platform for young men and women who danced and waved, their silhouettes outlined against floodlights that had once been meant to deter them. There is a temptation, in recounting such a night, to make it a moral fable with a simple lesson. Freedom triumphs, tyranny collapses, history corrects itself. But history is not a preacher. It is a record of human behavior under pressure, and it rarely offers unambiguous consolation. The opening of the wall was not the end of suffering, nor the arrival of a perfected world. It was the beginning of immense transformations, economic shocks, cultural dislocations, resentments that would simmer, and the long work of unifying not merely a territory, but memories and expectations. Yet one may say, without romance, that something real happened that night, the collapse of an enforced separation that had defied family, love, and ordinary movement. The most striking feature of the night was its mixture of the accidental and the inevitable. For years the conditions had been assembling: Soviet restraint, Eastern European reform, economic decline, civic protest, the erosion of fear. Seen in retrospect, the wall's fall appears inevitable, as if it were destined to meet the fate of all walls built against human desire. And yet the moment of opening depended on contingencies: a miscommunicated regulation, a spokesman's careless phrasing, a crowd's decision to test a statement rather than wait for official clarification, a border officer's decision to lift a barrier rather than order violence. History, which seems in textbooks to move by grand causes, often turns on the moral choices of individuals placed at a point where the machinery fails, and a person must decide whether to repair it or let it break. Midnight passed. In the West, the celebration had the improvised character of a street festival that no one had planned, and no one wished to end. Champagne appeared, along with the cheap beer of students. People clinked bottles, not to toast a government, but to toast the end of a fear. In the East, the streets thinned as more and more citizens went to the border, returned, went again, as if to confirm that the permission was real. Some visited relatives they had not seen for decades. Some simply walked down Kurfürstendamm, that emblem of West Berlin consumption, with the wide-eyed bewilderment of those who have stepped out of a grayscale photograph into a color film. Others came back quickly, anxious to return to their children, their apartments, their responsibilities, already sensing that life would resume, but not quite as it had been. Above it all stood the wall itself, suddenly transformed from instrument to stage, from threat to souvenir. People chipped at it with hammers and chisels, not because they thought they could dismantle it in a night, but because the act of striking concrete had become a way of marking the end of intimidation. The wall that had been meant to last a century became, in hours, a thing that could be touched and damaged. This, too, is a lesson of power. It is maintained not only by force, but by the shared belief that it cannot be altered. Once belief dies, even concrete begins to look temporary. In government offices that night, there was no comparable jubilation, only confusion, urgency, and the dull panic of administrators watching their categories dissolve. The border regulations were rewritten in real time by events. The party, which had imagined itself the architect of history, found itself a spectator. There were surely men in East German security services who considered harsher measures. There were surely officers who wished for decisive orders. But in the paralysis of responsibility, no one dared to authorize a massacre that would be seen instantly, broadcast across the world, and condemned by the very Soviet Union that had once backed such acts. The regime's violence, like an unused sword, had grown blunt. By dawn, Berlin had not yet been unified, Germany had not yet been reunited, and Europe had not yet found a new equilibrium. The wall still stood in long stretches. But something had changed more than policy. The population had discovered its own power. Citizens who had been trained to think of politics as something done to them had, by their presence, rewritten the state's most sacred rule. They had made a boundary irrelevant, and in doing so, they revealed a truth that dictatorships spend their lives concealing, that the governed are many and the governors few, that obedience is a habit, not a law of nature, and that the greatest fortifications are often maintained by an agreement in the mind. If one seeks the night's meaning, one might find it not in speeches, but in the small scenes repeated 1,000 times, a woman crossing with tears on her cheeks and laughter in her mouth, A border guard staring at the stamp in his hand as though it were suddenly a relic. A stranger offering a flower to someone whose accent marked them as other only yesterday. A young man standing on the wall where a bullet might once have found him, looking down at the city as if it were finally whole. The wall opened because a system of fear met a moment when fear could not command enough belief to function. It opened not with the roar of artillery, but with the shuffling of paperwork and the pressure of ordinary people insisting, for once, on being treated as citizens of their own lives. And perhaps that is the sober wonder of it, that a division upheld by ideology, surveillance, and concrete could be undone in a night by a sentence spoken carelessly, a crowd that refused to go home, and a handful of men at checkpoints who chose, without glory and without certainty, to lift a barrier rather than raise a rifle.